what I'm going to be talking about today is fortitude. And what is fortitude? It's not a term that we use a whole lot in contemporary discourse. It was very important in the ancient world and in the Renaissance. It's a variation of courage, which is one of the 4 cardinal virtues, but it's a special kind of courage. It's not bravery on the battlefield, but endurance and patience, the ability to get through hard stretches in our lives. So fortitude is related to contentment, which Sean talked about last week. Contentment involves making one's peace, achieving a sense of well-being within a difficult situation. And fortitude has to do with gathering the strength required for the long haul. Both contentment and fortitude can sound rather passive. They're not especially modern values, which often emphasize active transformation through striving. Yet contentment and fortitude involve real imaginative work as you try to figure out how to make sense of hardship and survive those aspects of life that we are not always able to change. It's kind of summed up for me in what Hamlet refers to as the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune and the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to, right? The host of ills that we all suffer at some time in our lives. And we can talk about that imaginative work that we saw last week with contentment, that we'll see this week with fortitude, as spiritual exercise, by which I mean a deeply engaged mental activity that's somewhat programmatic and that involves the whole person, body, mind, and soul. And I'm going to focus today on Stoicism, which is the philosophy that really repurposed military courage into personal fortitude using these techniques of spiritual exercise. Now, some Stoic exercises can sound callous and unfeeling, such as discounting or downplaying the loss of children and other loved ones. Stoicism is not for everyone or for every occasion. Yet, as a way of dealing with some of the daily struggles that we have all undergone in the pandemic, for example, or as a way of confronting health disasters, I personally have found Stoicism to be very useful. Right before the pandemic began, I was in a very bad car accident. And reading Stoic philosophy gave me some of that fortitude, some of that strength and courage that I needed in order to tackle what was actually very difficult work of physical and cognitive rehab. I should also add that studying the Psalms with my rabbi and a community of readers was also very sustaining. So the message here is reading matters, especially reading in community, as we are doing with this group. And so we're going to be looking at fortitude as developed in Stoic philosophy and Shakespearean drama. And we will also look along the way at Shakespeare's use of the Bible in tandem with Stoicism. I like combining these classical and biblical sources when I can. So I want to start by just looking at a spiritual exercise by the Roman emperor and philosopher Marcus Aurelius. And we're just going to take apart what he has to say and what the different Stoic elements are in this exercise, which are from his meditations, his journal. And I would actually love to have a volunteer from the group read this for me.
Begin the morning by saying to yourself, I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial. He who insults me is not only of the same blood or seed, but he participates in the same intelligence and the same portion of the divinity. I can neither be injured by any of them, for no one can fix on me what is ugly, nor can I be angry with my kinsman, nor hate him, for we are made for cooperation, like feet, like hands, like eyelids, like the rows of the upper and lower teeth. To act against one another, then, is contrary to nature, and it is acting against one another to be vexed and to turn your back on him.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. So this is how Marcus, as an emperor and a philosopher, would start his day. He was fortifying himself for a day in the public eye where he might not always be appreciated or respected. And there are several different spiritual techniques embedded in this passage. One is the idea that insults are damaging only if you allow them to be. This is what another Stoic philosopher, Epictetus, says about this matter. He says, remember that it is not he who reviles or strikes you who insults you, but it is your opinion about these things as being insulting. And Hamlet, who was a kind of struggling, not very good student of Stoicism, put this in a famous line, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so, an idea which Hamlet took from both the Stoic and the skeptical philosophers. A related but distinct idea in Marcus Aurelius's passage is the idea that my anger damages me more than the other person. And the philosopher Seneca wrote a whole essay on this, and he says, anger hurts the one who is angry, very like a falling rock, which breaks itself into pieces on the very thing which it crushes. Another aspect that really struck me is Marcus's attention to his own bodily experience in relation to other creatures in an ordered natural world. The Stoics called this oikeiosis, which sounds a lot like ecology, and it means sensing oneself as a living being with distinctive faculties and needs, which include care for other beings. Cicero translated this phrase as sensus sui, sensing oneself in one's proper functioning. And the idea here is that once we recognize ourselves as part of an interconnected world, we might be able to better act in accordance with the nature, with that natural order and that network that we have just brought into our minds. Now, that's kind of an abstract point, and that leads me to the fourth element, which is the role of metaphor and imagination in spiritual exercise. Notice that he ends this passage with an elaborate metaphor, which we can really take as a visualization exercise. He says, for we are made for cooperation, like feet, like hands, like eyelids, like the rows of the upper and lower teeth. And I think you can imagine Marcus kind of slowing down here, right? Imagining himself as his own foot, feeling his whole being in his hands, focusing on that eyelid, which is probably closed, right? Feeling those teeth coming into contact with each other. It's interesting that the metaphor concerns the body, right? It engages the whole body. The exercise is spiritual, meaning that it involves this mental work of visualization, but it really involves the whole person, and it places that person in dialogue with other beings in a metaphor that takes us into ourselves in order to take us out of ourselves, to put us in connection with others and with the cosmos. So here are those four elements together, and they're all part of Marcus's Stoic practice, and we can find lots of precedents for them in various Stoic philosophers of the ancient world. So what about Shakespeare? He's who has brought us together here today. Well, in terms of the word fortitude, it was interesting. I did a word search, and Shakespeare doesn't actually use that word very often, 4 times to be exact. And his most beautiful and direct description of fortitude is actually in one of his latest plays, which is The Tempest. And in this passage, Prospero is talking to his daughter Miranda, and he's remembering what it was like to be floating out in the open sea with her as a baby after they've been exiled from Milan. And hey, Greg, you actually played Prospero in New Swan Shakespeare Festival's production. Would you mind reading this for us?
Sure. Okay. Hi, everybody. Oh, a cherubim thou wast that did preserve me. Thou didst smile, infused with a fortitude from heaven, when I have decked the sea with drops full salt under my burthen groan, which raised in me an undergoing stomach to bear up against what should ensue.
Wow, thank you, Greg.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So what's happening here? Prospero had been collapsing under the burden of his own situation, but he was able to draw strength, that is, to build his own fortitude, when he sees his baby daughter smiling at sea. It's interesting that fortitude is built here in this relationship between father and daughter, right? That involves this kind of loving exchange between them. And it appears to be, again, a kind of a whole person experience, right? It involves what he calls the undergoing stomach, as well as the emotions and the mind. It's also interesting that Miranda's fortitude comes from heaven. So we have this Christian doctrine of infused or divine virtue mixed in here with Stoic ideas. So we're going to turn now to our main course, which is Shakespeare's As You Like It, and this very famous speech by Duke Sr. to his band of exiled followers. Like Prospero, Duke Sr. has been exiled from his dukedom by an ambitious brother. Unlike Prospero, he has been separated from his daughter. He has not been separated from his daughter, Rosalind. He is in a forest, not an island, and he has followers whom he is addressing in this speech. And what I want to do with you is to consider this speech as a Stoic exercise, looking at some of these elements that we have developed together. And I'm really pleased that Greg Ungar, one of our lead actors in New Swan Shakespeare Festival, and also an associate artistic director for the festival, has agreed to share Duke Sr. from As You Like It.
Now, my co-mates and brothers in exile, hath not old custom made this life more sweet than that of painted pomp? Are not these woods more free from peril than the envious court? Here feel we not the penalty of Adam, the season's difference, as the icy fang and churlish chiding of the winter's wind, which, when it bites and blows upon my back, even till I shrink with cold, I smile and say, this is no flattery. These are counselors that feelingly persuade me what I am. Sweet are the uses of adversity, which, like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel in his head. And this, our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything.
So happy to have you be able to share that with you. In fact, I'm going to refer to the Duke now as Duke Gregory, because you've embodied this speech so perfectly for us. So I want to start just by unpacking the general sense of the thing. These guys who were used to the luxuries of court life now find themselves living in the woods. It's cold out. Sometimes they are pictured shivering around a meager campfire. The Duke's job is to persuade them that this life is in fact better than the luxuries of court which they were used to experiencing. Another Stoic exercise favored by Seneca, by the way, was that he advised his wealthy students to go camping several times a year to accustom themselves to living without the usual conveniences. There's a little bit of that in this pastoral play. The Duke says, in a line that has given actors and editors some pause, "Here feel we not the penalty of Adam." So the penalty of Adam is our first bit of Bible, right? It's the punishments wrought by the fall, which include what the Duke refers to here as the season's differences, right? The extremes of heat and cold, of winter and summer. The phrasing is a little confusing, right? He says, "Here feel we not the penalty of Adam." And that's actually not true, right? Aren't they super exposed to the climate, right? In their exile state, living among the trees? They absolutely feel it. So what he means here is, let's feel the penalty of Adam in a new way. Let's take these physical sensations and try to think about them differently, so they no longer burden us so much, right? Thinking makes it so, in Hamlet's Stoic skeptical phrase. Now, that kind of thinking is a work, right? It's an imaginative work as well as rational work, if you want it to actually make a difference in your sense of yourself and the world. And so, like Marcus Aurelius, the Duke turns to metaphor, right? He compares the biting cold of the winds to the faux gentility of flattering counselors at court. Now, Marcus is talking about insults, and Duke Gregory is talking about flattery, but both the emperor and the Duke are neutralizing potentially harmful social speech. And how do they do that? By using their own rational and imaginative capacities, right, to rid those forms of speech of their sting. And of course, although the Duke is talking about flattery, he's thinking about exile, which is social insult writ very large indeed. And I think we should have the sense here, and I think our own Duke Gregory presented this very convincingly in his rendition, we should have the sense here these ideas do not come easily. They are not simply accepted without effort on the part of his listeners. Indeed, his follower and friend Amiens responds by using the word translation, which I really love here, right? Translation nicely emphasizes the movement between two spheres of experience, two different grammars or languages of living, two locations, court and forest, which are ruled by very different customs. So what about the embodied quality of Marcus's meditation? Do we have any of that here? I definitely think we have that in this speech, right? Duke Gregory is very much in the moment, right? He's feeling the cold, even as he tries to make something good of it. I loved our Duke Gregory's costuming to try to communicate to you some of that cold. And he says, these are counselors that feelingly persuade me what I am. I would call this an oikeiosis moment, right? A sensus sui, or a self-perception moment. He is sensing himself and his own constitution, physical and rational, through his feelings. And he's trying to use those feelings of embodiment to come into his best self, right? To persuade him of what he is, to be as true as possible to his nature or constitution. And while we're talking about nature, right, nature was a part of Marcus's meditation, and Shakespeare has put his hero right smack in the middle of nature, right in the forest. And the natural world is very, very much present in the speech. I love, love, love those final lines, right? Finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. So tongues in trees, this means language in languages, right? Maybe prompting his friend's reference to translation. The trees speak to him. And later in the play, Orlando will start writing love poems in their bark. Books in the running brooks. I love the way he literally finds one word in another, right? Sounding brooks for the books hidden in the letters, and in the process mirroring the bubbling sound of the brook itself, which runs through his rhythmic speech and connects language to nature and nature to language. Sermons in stones. Well, a spiritual exercise is kind of like a sermon, right? He's giving a sermon to his followers. Sermon also starts to take us out of classical philosophy and back into a more pointedly scriptural or biblical discourse here. And indeed, the speech ends with another clear echo of the book of Genesis, with that phrase, good in everything. So let's do a little bit of Genesis review here. After each day of creation, God sees that his creation is good, tov. On the sixth day, when he has finished creating land animals and human beings, he saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good, tov ma'od. So there's an extra word added in there, right? The very. How is this very good different from good? That's a question that first came to my attention about 20 years ago when I first read the Jewish philosopher Franz Rosenzweig. And he has a very intriguing commentary on this passage, which he in turn derives from some of the great medieval rabbis. He says that the very introduces a kind of super creation into creation, right? A kind of nature that is more than nature. We might think of this as a margin or space for reflection, right? Like the margin of a page where you can write your own notes next to a passage. Rosenzweig goes on to identify this very with death as experienced by human beings. He says that the death creates a sense of history, and that sense of history is what makes renewal possible. Not just natural renewal, but spiritual renewal, right? The chance for new beginnings in our lives. The beginnings in the stories or histories that we tell about our own journeys, about our own challenges of becoming. So would Duke Sr. agree with this? I think there is some sense of that insight bubbling in the Duke's speech. The Duke doesn't say very good. He says good in everything. But essentially that the word very is embedded in the word every, just like books is embedded in brooks. The Duke is even teaching us how to read one word hidden in another word. The Duke has begun the speech with the penalty of Adam, right? A penalty which includes death. And he ends with the goodness of creation, a goodness that includes death, includes the seasons, includes our human vulnerability. Why? Because those challenges are precisely what open us up to renewal and repair, right? Which give us a chance to make and mark new beginnings. By the way, that is a very Shakespearean theme. You may remember that there's actually a character named Adam in As You Like It. He's the old servant to the young Orlando, and he gives all of his retirement savings to his master and insists on following him into the forest. But guess what? The journey is really hard on Adam, and he ends up needing Orlando's help. And this shifts Orlando's own mindset from the injured pride, which occupies him in the beginning of the play, to the loving care that Adam now needs from him. And we can see Orlando practicing his own visualization exercise, his own turn to metaphor, when he compares himself to a doe taking care of its fawn. So, in Shakespeare's Stoic scriptural world, the penalty of Adam, the disabling weight of sin, the dark side of human nature exists. But if you have the right mindset, if you can figure out how to take strength or fortitude from your own vulnerability in a connected world, you might be able to find at least some good in at least some parts of everything in at least some part of the day. I set my bar at a reasonable height. When I was wheelchair bound for several months last year, I depended on my wonderful husband, Ken, who is here today, and he's going to make me cry, to take care of my basic needs and also to keep our household running in the first weeks of a very frightening pandemic. That was really tough for him, and it was tough for me. And acknowledging my own dependence was definitely part of this wider, gracious Stoicism that I'm trying to learn how to practice in dialogue with Shakespeare. I kept telling myself then, it's not only good, it's very good. It's tov ma'od to be in my family's loving care. So I thought for a discussion that we might look at some of these Stoic techniques, and I'm just curious to know if any of them resonate for you, if you see them elsewhere in Shakespeare and other works that you read, or in other spiritual practices that you might be familiar with. And I'm going to start with a poll, just as a way of getting us thinking about this, and share the results. A lot of distribution here. With thinking makes it so slightly higher than being a living being in a connected world. My anger hurts me being number 3. Visualization and metaphor not really resonating for people, and several of you not connecting to any of these Stoic principles. So I think that gives us a lot to talk about. Nice to have you here.
Hello. I don't know.
You've written on As You Like It. Is that correct for your senior thesis?
That was one of the plays that I wrote on, including the Duke Senior speech.
So what are your thoughts? That's great.
I don't know if this is going too specific, but just because there was a pause, I wanted to ask, you talked about the penalty of Adam. And if I'm not mistaken, one of the penalties of Adam in the Bible is that of labor, agricultural labor. And I was just wondering how we could consider labor as part of this conversation of Stoicism and Shakespeare's view of fortitude.
Absolutely. Of course, labor is very important in this play, as Anna well knows. And, we part of, I think, having, Greg there shivering in his coat and indicating that this is a what we call literary criticism hard pastoral rather than soft pastoral. It's not Club Med. It's a kind of rigorous involuntary camping trip that they are on. Is that labor is going to be necessary to survive. And in fact, they pivot almost instantly from this speech to a discussion of hunting. And hunting is clearly both a kind of a sport, but also a survival activity for this band of men living in the forest. We also have shepherds who are involved in physical labor, and that labor is in the process of being monetized, financialized by new property laws and land practices in the play. So Shakespeare is very, very interested in the role of work with dignity, of work from which dignity is being drained, for all of his characters, both his noble characters who have different kinds of work, different kinds of offices, what Cicero would call officium or duty, and the characters, who would be more working class, and their relationship to their work. And I'm still reading the Ishiguro novel, Clara and the Sun. And part of that novel is about a world in which there's very few people have work, and they belong to a class called the post-employed. And it's very interesting to see how, what is experienced as a penalty, the burden of Adam, can, in a rapidly evolving society, take on a very different meaning. That's a great question, Anna. So it looks like we have some K2. Do you want to? I love the fact that K2 wants to connect this to Zoroastrianism. So maybe K2, you can unmute and share your thoughts on that.
Thank you. I mean, I just remarked that the word fortitude is really something I connect with. It doesn't feel like an old-fashioned or whatever. I think it's a very important word in our world. And in my Zoroastrian faith, there is a great deal of respect, not only for humans, but for all living creatures. So it could be animals, insects, plants. So, there is that sort of widespread respect, which also connects to how you deal with emotional challenges in life, so that we address, and I think there was some sense of self-perception that Julia talked about, and the wholeness of the person in terms of responding to something. And in that, to emphasize a sense of love and care, rather than, other kinds of emotions with life's challenges. And I also thank Julia for sharing some of her personal experiences. And now, I'm just personally, and we all are delighted you're in a new beginning with the help of Ken and your whole loving family. So thank you for that.
And my community of friends, both far and near, including Sean. So it takes a lot to come back and to get that fortitude back to be able to do this work. And I appreciate that so much. And I appreciate your also bringing in the Zoroastrian context here. It's really beautiful.
Thank you.
Jessica Howland has made a really interesting comment too. Jessica, if you're there, do you want to repeat the substance of what you put in the chat?
Sure. It was basically, as he was talking about nature, he referred to nature as unfeeling, and I didn't take that as a mean. I took it as nature is unfeeling. It doesn't care if we live or die, but it's also not stabbing us in the back or trying to betray us or harm us the way the people in court were. So I liked the sort of stoicism of nature that he describes, and ends with that it's all good.
That's a really beautiful point. I like that a lot. I think that there is a sense in the play that nature is sentient. I'm not sure I would call, and I think that is somewhat a Stoic idea, but is maybe not at the heart of Stoicism. But there is this sense. There's a wonderful passage in the play where there's reflection on the deer who has been wounded and is dying a painful death by itself. And it's quite a complex image. A bunch of us read this play last spring through the Susie Q Center in Laguna Beach, and we spent some time on this passage. It's not straightforwardly an animal rights passage. It's presented through kind of layers of irony and framing. But at its heart is this insight into a sentient nature, which I think is very interesting to see Shakespeare entertaining that idea, even without necessarily fully embracing all of its implications.
I think just to pick up on that part of what you said, Julia, for a second, that speech comes right after the speech you've drawn our attention to today, the lords around Duke Senior turn their attention to Jaques, another lord, and they refer to him sort of posturing and soliloquizing really over the body of the dying deer, but not intervening to help. So, I mean, that's the other side of the sort of beautiful philosophical moment, right, that Duke Senior gives us, in which he seems to have transcended his losses through philosophy. There's Jaques pointing out that they are now usurping the woods from the creatures in the same way that Duke Senior's brother usurped his kingdom from him. That's one. And two, I think Jaques is there in the play to remind us that that there's another side to philosophizing, right? And that side has more teeth, and it turns back onto the philosophizer, the philosopher, to ask whether he's really being sufficiently self-critical. So I think that the two of them together add up to some account of what it means to derive wisdom from an experience of really significant loss of position. Roger Owens has his hand up, and after him, Stephen Angel.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to return to the idea of work in relation to our current pandemic situation as well. Many people have lost their jobs or have had to redefine themselves in some way. And this passage speaks to the idea of, the Duke having had a role, and suddenly he's forced to have a different role. And so he has to reconsider his options and his relationship to others and to nature. So I think all of this passage just really applies a lot to what we've been going through this past year.
That's beautiful. I love the way the passage begins. My co-mates and brothers in exile. Like, would he have addressed his court in that same egalitarian fashion before being exiled? Or would he have had a sharper sense of hierarchy back at court? This is the first line that Duke Gregory has in the play. And, what is Shakespeare communicating in this first line about the transformation that's probably only partial and maybe only temporary, but is a transformation that the Duke has undergone in this movement from one place to another, this translatio or transposition that he has undergone, and that now he has to subjectivize, as we have had to subjectivize changes this year. So I really like that point, Roger.
Yeah, I think that is a beautiful point. And he says he's capable. Think about where he is in the moment of this speech. He's capable of seeing them as co-equals, as Julia just said. And yet none of them treat him as anything but the Duke. And he doesn't treat any of them as anything but courtiers, right? The whole new society that's begun to flourish in the woods with a philosopher king still has a king, or a philosopher duke anyway. And at the end of the play, he will say, I'm just looking it up now, once we've celebrated all these weddings, and all these people shall share the good of our returned fortune, my fortune, Duke Senior's, according to the measure of their states, right? And the meaning of that word states either means the positions that were taken from them by my younger brother before we went into exile, or it means something like the new states of awareness and self-understanding that they've all achieved after this period of sort of philosophical exile in the woods. And I love that ambiguity that Shakespeare raises the possibility that a genuinely philosophical society in which human beings are co-equals and reflect on their shared circumstances is taking root there, and that possibly the same system of brother against brother is about to reassert itself in a slightly different way than it had been before the beginning of the play. Stephen,
there's also the third possibility is that, which I think is very much part of a worldview that's no longer one that we're comfortable talking about, is that reciprocity and hierarchy are not mutually exclusive.
Right.
And that you can have a relationship, take a parent and child or a teacher and student, where there is a hierarchy, But that hierarchy doesn't need to become fossilized or unilateral or coercive if it is kept flexible and in flow and allows for transformation and occasional reversals within that relationship. So we see that in the servant-master relationship with Adam and Orlando. We see it with male-female relationships in the play. We see it with the Duke and his followers. We see it with different types of fools and foolery. We see it with foolery and wisdom as discourses that exist in a hierarchy, but also in a flow with each other. And so I think we could have a return to a traditional society, but with the reciprocities and plasticities and flexibilities that are part of that. Sorry, that's my phone going off. The reciprocities that can be part of those estates and states return to some kind of form of fluidity. So I often find when I teach this play, I taught it both at the graduate level this past winter, and then I also read it with our community group, that there's too much of an opposition between the egalitarian and the hierarchical. And for Shakespeare, those things could coexist. And that theater is one of the places where they coexist, where they're kept in motion and exercise. Like, I really like this idea of exercise, which has the element of sport, of play, but also of discipline, of order, of process. And that when things are exercised, they are fortified. They're also rendered more plastic, more flexible.
Stephen, please make your comment.
Well, my comments, much of this discussion is way over my head, and I'm going to give a more mundane thoughts. One of the previous speakers talked about the impartiality of nature, which in my life, I relate to as the fact that I've been a golfer since probably the age of 7 or 8. And golf is, the basic rules of golf are that you play the course as you find it and the ball as it lies. Well, there's a lot of bad things that happen when you play golf. And getting angry, which many golfers do, and I did it in the past, is something that definitely works against you. Learning to be able to accept the various things that can happen to you on a golf course is a very positive thing. When you watch most of the pro golfers, when they hit the ball in the lake or in a sand trap or something like that, most all of them do not throw their golf club or get the stomp or whatever around. They maybe bow their head or something like that, but they accept that's where the ball went. And they pick up their clubs, or the caddy picks up their clubs, and they walk on and find the golf ball and they hit it again. And this is something that has I've translated into the rest of my life, that you can't control much of your life. There are some aspects that you can control, but as Vin Scully said, man plans and God laughs. So I enjoyed that aspect of your discussion, that nature is there and you just have to live with it.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I'm interested that I would say that's an example of a visualization exercise that you just did, which is taking something from one part of life and figuring out, translating it to another part of life. And I think we turn to activities that we're intimate with in creating those metaphors. and that those metaphors then can become guides as we encounter challenges that are distinct from that area from which we're taking the metaphor. So this is done not just in Stoicism, but in spiritual practices around the world. But it's interesting to see it just in the vernacular emerging in what you just said, Stephen. So thank you for that. I think we have a lot of comments here. Do you want to choose one of these, Sean? Are you? We have time for maybe a couple more comments, and then we'll have to let people get there.
12:50. I just wanted to make sure you knew that. So,
yes.
Julie Fraser asked a really interesting question about Stoicism, in the modern moment. And Julie, do you want to repeat your question? Are you still there?
Hi, everyone. My question was, in our current times, can Stoicism be seen as a selfish effort to ignore or not understand pain that others are feeling?
Yeah. And I began to answer that question with some super pedantry in the chat. So a short answer is that the Stoics very emphatically disfavor pity, which they see as the loss of self-control, right? A giving way to emotion as the basis for a judgment about how to act. But that is not to say that they advocated a life devoid of feelings for people who are suffering, much less a life devoid of compassion and what you might call in the Christian context good works. The school of philosophy known as Stoicism in the ancient world was a primary advocate for what they called philanthropia, right, which meant universal dedication to all persons, right? And what's remarkable about that is that philosophy took root in societies in Athens and later in Rome, where you could not have a more vertically oriented society in which the very few had everything and everyone else had nothing, zero, right? So somehow Stoicism gets this bad rap about being devoid of feeling because they don't want strong feelings to be the basis of judgment or action based on judgment. So I think in a way we need to unmodernize our idea. Well, frankly, the idea that Stoics are devoid of feeling was very prominent in the Renaissance among Christian theologians and critics who thought that Stoicism was in a fundamental conflict with the good life modeled by Jesus in the Gospels, right? They referred to them as blocks of wood because they don't seem to feel anything or to embrace feeling. And how could you add that mindset to a human life and not end up with cruelty, selfishness, and so on and so forth? But I think that's a somewhat unfair account of them.
Right. I don't think we see that. That's why I chose the Marcus Aurelius passage, because it does have that philanthropic sense, or also cosmopolitanism is associated with ancient Stoicism as well. The sense of universal fellowship based on relationships of care. And so that sense of the care for others, care of the self, sense of others, sense of the self is a very important part if we actually start reading the actual Stoics and not the caricature that we often have of what Stoicism is. That's not to say that Stoicism is an answer to all ethical problems. I think it's a part of the toolkit that Shakespeare had and that we might choose to have ourselves in dealing with aspects of life. And so that would be I didn't really start reading the Stoics seriously until my accident. And I had a fairly negative opinion of the Stoics and was much more in sympathy with Aristotle's ethics. I still love Aristotle's ethics, and that's a very important tool for me. But the Stoics actually spoke to me at a particular time in a way that now has made them a very important part of my mindset in a way that I wouldn't have anticipated 2 years ago. We're just about out of time now, so I'm just going to end with a comment from John Thompson, which I think is a really nice reading of Shakespeare to kind of give Shakespeare the last word here, and also the art of close reading, of being attentive to language and to imagery. John says, if we can find sermons in stones, if we can learn something even from the hardest things we encounter in life, it's nothing short of miraculous transformation of our own conditions of possibility. I think that's also what Franz Rosenzweig is saying in that intriguing commentary on the very good from the book of Genesis. And it's certainly part of what the Duke the Duke, but also Shakespeare is trying to think through in this passage. I want to thank all of you for coming and staying and for participating, for speaking. I think we can continue with this more discussion-like format as we move into the second half of this series. And of course, I want to thank Greg Ungar for the wonderful presentation of Duke Senior's speech, as well as a little cameo from the temple. So, Sean, do you want to tell us about next week?
Sure. Next week, we're going to look at a passage that I mentioned in passing last week. That's Polonius's farewell speech to Laertes in Act 1, Scene 3, a kind of classical location for Shakespeare's wisdom and the generator of many of Shakespeare's most famous moral maxims, right, so to speak. So we'll send you out that text in the next few days. And I'm delighted to say that my colleague here, Patty Gallagher, who's professor of theater arts and an actor, will be playing the part of Polonius for us.